Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Women in Data Science Cambridge Conference.
We're ready to get going with our first panel, Women of Color in Data Science. And I'm delighted to introduce the moderator, Alana Anderson, and she is the relatively new Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing. So thank you, Alana, very much for joining us today and leading us in the discussion with some amazing panelists.
Thank you so much to Kathy and Erin and all of the organizers of today's conference. And I'm really excited to get us started on today's panel. So welcome to everyone joining us for the Women of Color in Data Science panel. I'm excited to moderate this session with our panelists and hear more about their experiences and engage in dialogue about how we continue the work of creating expansive and inclusive spaces within the field of data science. Today, I'm joined by three panelists, Dr. Sarah Brown, Assistant Professor of Computer Science and Director of the ML4 STS Lab from the University of Rhode Island, Dr. Chris Dorsey, Associate Professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Department of Physical Therapy, Movement and Rehabilitation Sciences at Northeastern University, and Dr. Asia Wilson, Assistant Professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science here at MIT. So we have a finite amount of time, but a lot to unpack and talk about. So I want to start by having each of our panelists provide some opening remarks. I'll encourage our audience that as discussion unfolds to share any questions that you might have, and we'll work to incorporate them into our Q&A session. So I'm going to start with Dr. Brown, and then I'll pass things along to Dr. Dorsey, and then have Dr. Wilson share at the end as well. So Dr. Brown, take it away.
Hi, good morning. I'm excited to be here and sharing. And I'm just going to share a little about my background and kind of what I work on and some highlights of my experiences in the field so far. So my training, I was trained as an engineer, though my title now says I'm a professor of computer science. Sometimes that means things kind of change a lot, but I think that's typical for people who work in data science. Data science integrates from a lot of different areas. And so while I started electrical engineering thinking I was going to build biomedical devices, I realized I liked working with the data that came out of them better. And I transitioned into doing more machine learning research during my PhD. And then I started seeing a lot of work where people were talking about fairness and social equity of the algorithmic systems we were building. And I realized that a lot of the people who were talking about this were using very interesting, but their theoretical computer science knowledge and zero of their personal experiences to do that type of work. So these were, it's good, theoretical, exciting work, but they're white men talking about how to be fair in a very abstract mathematical sense. And that didn't feel quite right. So over time, I've now shifted my research into that space, kind of working with fairness, thinking about how we can broaden in the work that we do, as we use data to make decisions in the world, how can we think about how social systems actually influence that? And fortunately, my work doing machine learning applied to neuroscience, where we were dealing with a lot of uncertainty and we don't really know what brains do, actually applies to social systems. We also don't really know for sure how people work at mass scale, right? We don't know how to predict these things with lots of uncertainty. I've been able to do that. And I think what's been really exciting is that I've also been able to now combine my technical expertise in machine learning with the expertise I had built up before as a student, as a leader in the National Society of Black Engineers, looking at how to improve equity and how to improve the field and how to bring more people into engineering at large, and then now focusing in on data science. So I've worked with the National Society of Black Engineers for many years to help students make sure they graduate, which is the thing we all have to do at some point, and helping students figure out how to navigate various academic transitions. And now as a professor, I get to do that from a different position. I have more insight into all the things and why they don't work that I saw that didn't work as a student and I didn't know. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Dr. Dorsey.
Good morning, everyone. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in addition to my position at Northeastern this year, I have the pleasure and honor of being an MIT MLK Fellow in the MIT Media Lab. So my background is actually in microsystems, microsensors for inertial sensing and chemical sensing. And since I got my PhD just under 10 years ago, that sort of morphed from soft sensing for soft mechanical sensing for health applications now into soft robotics. And so that's where the data science bit plays in, I think, really as a result of my work in robotics. And so I'm really heartened for this conversation today. I was recently talking to a student who's considering joining my lab. She's a woman, and I mentioned generally, I think things are getting better in tech majors, but that I wanted her to know that I had her back if she encountered any sort of bias or anything that felt weird. And I was sort of mentioning this as reflecting on some challenges I had as a PhD student related to both gender and race. And she looked at me and she said, thank you for saying that, but I would expect nothing less. And so I was bowled over and delighted that she was coming into the program with that energy. And I think we should all expect nothing less than for the institutions that we work for and work with to have our backs as women and gender minorities, as people of color, that we get a say in what fairness and equity looks like in data science. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. Dr. Wilson.
Hi, everyone. So I just recently joined as a professor here at MIT, but before in my graduate school days, I guess some of the experiences I've had surrounding equity work was very different, more personal and interactive. And as I've kind of come along, I've tried to center it a little bit more in my research. And I find that happens a lot with women of color and people of color, very, much more generally. It's hard when you see so many problems to not want to focus those problems in what you're doing in your research. And it's also hard to be encouraged in that pursuit as you travel along your academic life. And I'm sure we'll get more into that in the panel. But that is to say, I'm really excited to be here and to discuss a lot of these issues. So I'll hold it there and resume later.
Thank you so much for sort of starting us out and sharing your experiences. And I guess I would love to start, Dr. Dorsey, you talked about supporting a potential graduate student that would be going into the field. So I'd love perspective on kind of where you all see the field of data science in relation to being open and inclusive for women of color, and kind of what were your experiences like in your graduate programs, and sort of how have you continued to see changes and transformation, or where are there places where the field still feels very stagnant relative to the experiences of women of color? So I will start with Dr. Dorsey, if that's okay.
Sure. So I think it feels like things have changed and not changed in some ways, and that's sort of a strange statement to make. So if you look at what and so I'm based in academia, I'm bringing an academic perspective to this largely, but I also see this in industrial support, that there is so much more talk around wanting to diversify, wanting to be inclusive, wanting to be equitable, and what does that mean in our different spaces. And so it feels like there's a lot of energy focus, but as I look at the field and the results, there's not necessarily an improvement in who's coming into our spaces or who's remaining in our spaces. And so what that says to me is there's some sort of disconnect between what we're saying and what we're doing, or if we're taking the right actions and if we're taking those consistently over time. So if we're really making efforts, for example, to recruit women into STEM fields and into tech and into data science. And we're having all of these first-year undergraduates who are really excited about data science that by senior year, they've moved on to other majors. Wow, that's a big flashing sign that we need to consider what happens in those 3.5 years that are encouraging women and encouraging students of color to leave the field, that they're feeling pushed out for some reason.
Dr. Wilson, I know I want to ask you a similar question, but I also know contextually you had some experiences in industry. I think you did your postdoc at Microsoft. So I wonder too if there are parallels in academia and industry in terms of what's happening in space making for women of color, or is one better at it than the other?
So I guess it's a little bit hard as I've changed my position. So my vantage point as I've moved through these institutions, I wonder how things would have been as more of a decision maker at Microsoft. But from my observation, there wasn't much difference. And, it's sometimes frustrating because a lot of people want to do things, but then at the end of the day, they're like, let's just get a task force, and that's where I think ideas go to die. Like there's no action. It's just always this kind of rumble of talking, and it's just very frustrating to see very little just action in the space of getting more people in the door and trying to increase diversity in the data science world. So yeah, I think it's hard also then for the few people who do get in and having those support structures there, it creates this, from the grad student point of view, it was extremely hard to find the support systems, and it overburdens the few people who are already there to be mentors for people. So, I just really see a need for more direct action to actually start creating pipelines for people to actually enter these spaces. And it's ironic because I think Sarah mentioned it, that their most pressing problems, or we are uniquely positioned to see a lot of problems with things. And I think that makes for amazing research. And it's a shame that there aren't more of us looking at these issues. They're underfunded and there's underrepresentation. There's just like a lot of just not as much as there needs to be when it comes to data science and having people of color there to work on real pressing problems. So I'll table it there and let Sarah take it away.
Sarah, join us. I know also you had talked in your opening about being connected to NSBE and other sort of organizations that really do focus in on the student experience, the identity experience of students in academic disciplines. So please join in.
Yeah, I think Aisha really started getting at some of the core points there, is that there's a lack of women in color in the field to some extent, but there's a much bigger problem with retention. One of the things that, while I was on the board for the National Society of Black Engineers for NSBE, was that we shifted our emphasis from being so heavy on, if we just got kids in, they're interested in this in middle school, we could just keep them till they got to college, it would be fine, to really noticing that in engineering, engineering graduation rates are low for everyone, but they're especially low for Black people, like 30-40% national average. And so we started focusing on retention. And I think that kind of shifted how we shaped our programming and what supports we made. How do we make people graduate? I think if we kind of compare that to data science actually, I think relative to some other computing fields, has more interest from women of color. They show up at the beginning, but the retention problem is really where and so people are like, oh, we just need to get more. And so I think in data science as a whole, the dialogue, I think, is a little bit behind fields like kind of engineering at large in some ways, but I think our numbers are probably not that much worse. And I think there's data science field has tons of interest from industry, right? Even on the academic side, like, I was on the board for women in machine learning, and I was an advisor to Black and AI, and those two organizations have absolutely no problem raising corporate money. Like, they will just throw money at them because the companies want to buy their way onto those websites to say that they paid. But then they're putting all this emphasis still, even at the postgraduate, just recruiting. They're paying tons of money so they can recruit people and not showing up for like things that probably would cost less than hundreds of $1,000s a year to retain them. Like being a little, not being a hostile work environment probably doesn't cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. No. But that's harder, right? As an individual person, human being, it means changing how you right? And so that's where people are kind of stuck. And so, Chris pointed at that people want to talk about it now as a problem, but not noticing what do we have to do about it. So I don't know that I have the answer, but I think that we're kind of at this point where people are at least presenting as willing to have the conversation, and we need to figure out how to take the conversations a little bit deeper into really identifying how things occur. And another point that's kind of on this is that one of the task forces, although I just said those are not as good, but within NSBE, it was a task force. And we had a task force on Black women in engineering. And one of the things that we did was we worked with engineering education researchers who study retention problems. And they had done some, there's very little disaggregated data that was by both race and gender. But the few studies we found that the reasons that Black women left and the reasons that Latino women left were completely unrelated. Like, there was almost zero overlap when you actually talk to the students who changed their major. The things that were causing them to leave was different. And so I think we have to really be careful about like how we group people together and how we talk about things and how we track data, and really doing it at scale the way we like to do our data science work isn't how people make decisions. We have to kind of balance those anecdotes because that's really what we have.
Yeah, I connect with the concept of differentiation and recognizing that as we sort of think about approach and strategy in DEI work, it's sometimes really important to differentiate that needs of one identity and community is going to be different than the needs of other, and we can't always sort of lump everyone together. So I appreciate that. And a couple of you talked about the need for a pipeline, but also the more focused need around really examining the issues relative to retention, and sort of that the pipeline is not going to save us if we're not retaining. So I guess the question is, what are the retention issues sort of as you all have either experienced it in being in community with other graduate women, particularly women of color, or in students that you support through the graduate experience? What are, like, to Dr. Brown, to your point, like, let's get into it. Like, what are the critical sort of systemic issues that we're seeing that we need to expose and then talk about working to fix? Anyone can jump in on this one. So I'll sort of let it go. I think Dr. Wilson.
I'll say something about my own observations for what I went through as a grad student and what the people who I mentor as grad students from other universities who are women of color seem to be expressing. And I think one of the common themes is finding people to work with, people who would work with you on projects. I know countless minority students who are excited to enter the space. They're in grad school, they have an advisor, and yet they cannot seem to connect with collaborators. And so it's a very lonely experience. And I think over time, it just becomes harder and harder to want to stay in the program. And initially, I think I was very fortunate to have an advisor that tried really to connect me with their other students and really tried to get me in the nexus of collaboration. And I think, but for that, it would have been it could have been a different road for me. It is just so important to create community and connections. And I think that minorities have a particularly hard time for a litany of reasons, have, a bunch of which have nothing to do with them and their talents. So I think the support, in that way. And I really do think that the advisor also plays a big role in making sure that the students in their group, a lot of people think it's okay to just admit the minority student and then they just kind of just take a step back, and do the meeting like once a month. And they're like, look, I have the student. And it's just really more than that. It's just the way peer effects work. It just is a thing that you have to pay attention to, how they are being absorbed in the greater program and in your group, generally speaking. So I'll table it there. I saw other people in the body.
Yeah, go for it, Dr. Dorsey.
I'm going to try and pull together some threads that I've heard both Drs. Brown and Wilson say in this discussion. So Dr. Wilson, to your point about task force are where things go to die, I think that's a really cogent point. And one of the places that we can make a lot of difference is I have been as a woman and a woman of color in tech spaces, been on so many diversity related meetings, committees, task force, and the question is always, let's study the problem, let's understand the problem, let's understand why we're not retaining students, why we're not retaining faculty. And there is frequently limited or no mandate for action. So once we have identified what the problem is, or we know that this is a problem globally or nationwide or in this region for academia or for industry, or we're seeing people leave for these reasons, what are we going to do about it? And I think that Dr. Brown, as you said, that's a challenging thing because it's not an expensive thing, but it requires understanding how to make systemic change. So if students are leaving because they can't find collaborators or they can't find a network, what supports are we going to provide to students? How do we rethink how we bring graduate students into our program? And then what supports do we provide them for networking? Who's going to provide those supports? Is it going to be the same 3 faculty members that always raise their hands for everything related to diversity and inclusion and they're already feeling pretty burnt out? Or are we going to put that on maybe a faculty member who would be great for it, but hasn't raised their hand in a little while? And so I think that's a concrete, very, very cheap, but very important thing that we could take into future endeavors is how do we move forward with action and change, systemic change, rather than just trying to identify the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want to kind of that instinct to just study it, and I want to pick up on that in particular. And when these task forces get formed, these large groups of people, we tend to want to study it with like a 10-foot pole. We're like prodding at it from a very distance, very cautiously, like maybe what's over there. But we have training that teaches us how to study complex systems, right? Like that is what we do. And in our work, we don't prod at it from a very, very, very distance cautiously. We like dive in, we try stuff, we see what works, we experiment. And so for me, it's really like hard and confusing to watch people who are willing to experiment like so aggressively in other things approach the composition of our field as this like, we have to be really careful and that's where the sort of like frustration sometimes hits for me, is that like, we as a field, people will like to say like, oh, well, I don't know social sciences, like I can't do this. But you do know STEM, like you do know this, you do know that knowledge is not completely unrelated. And I think that that's something as a field we can kind of reflect on and really change things with.
Go for it, Dr. Dorsey.
Can I ask you a follow-up about that thinking? Because I really like it, but I want to dig into it a little bit. So, I think like move fast and break things and try stuff and experiment is a good I think we're moving too slowly right now. But at the same point, I want to highlight that the cost of getting things wrong here is like people's psychological well-being and their livelihoods, and like this is not the same sort of experimentation that we should be like. We should really be cognizant that there's a huge human cost here about getting it wrong. And so like where is the line that you're thinking on that?
If I could jump in here too, what I think to Dr. Brown's point is, I do think that there's like material cost effects to doing it wrong or approaching it wrong, but there's this interesting piece of perfection that we expect in this work that we don't expect in the way in which science is done, the way in which we have intellectual inquiry about academic adventures. And so I think sort of to what Dr. Brown is saying is there's a particular slowness, but also this expectation of perfection on the first go. And if perfection isn't accomplished, then there's not a willingness to try again. There's not a willingness to go back to the drawing board and sort of retinker in the ways that sort of in how you all do your research and how you think about sort of approaching understanding a question, an academic question you do, right? And you wouldn't actually trust any research that was like perfect with like no issues with sort of how the data emerges, right? So that's sort of my perspective relative to understanding that it's so important, but also that we hide behind if we can't do it perfectly, we won't do it at all.
Yeah, I think that really quite eloquently sums up kind of like a lot of what I was really thinking there. And I think I also want to put out there that like the go fast and break things model that startups use is probably overall too fast, even in startup world. Like they break things that shouldn't be broken, right? That's what, as a person who's studying fairness in machine learning, a lot of what I study is that they're breaking things that shouldn't get broken because they're not even being cautious enough. But I think there's a lot of space between the speed at which diversity inclusion work moves, and where VCs throw money at startups to do the next AI thing that's not actually possible with AI, right? So I think there's some space in there, and I think that like the slowness kind of assumes that doing nothing is not causing active harm. Mm-hmm. And that anything they do will be like, if we do something that's imperfect, that will cause more harm than doing nothing. And I don't think that's true. And I think that that's the kind of thinking that I think could help us accelerate a little bit without going like over the top to just causing large scale psychological trauma.
So as we continue to think about sort of strategies and sort of the doing of the work, many times in DEI work, there's a conflation of gender, so that when we're thinking about sort of helping women, there's sort of an underlying understanding that it's white women because the interventions and the strategies don't have a true intersectional understanding of the particular struggles of women of color. So how do we think about in the work of doing better and fixing what the particularities are for women of color in the change that needs to happen, and also addressing the shortage of women of color that are data scientists?
I can take an initial probing at that. One thing I will say is sometimes it's disheartening to have a recognition of needing to increase diversity. And again, the increasing of women is seen as enough, and there are no people of color around. And I do think that that's kind of looked at as just kind of like our work here is done. And I definitely have seen that in my own experience. As for the particular experience of women of color, there are a litany of things that can be done to really focus in on this group. But I will say that just being that there are so few, it really becomes hard to navigate space. There are very few people to refer to, very few people to, it's just kind of bleeding into what we've already discussed, but there's just so much more support structures that need to be built around that particular cohort of people. And it's just very unique to that experience. And so I think very few people, when they're thinking through how to increase people of color, in particular women of color, understand that, you know, it's just not enough to admit. And it goes unavoided. So I have a lot of thoughts there about things that should and ought to be done, but it really takes the will of the entire cohort. And I mean, if for anybody here who's working or who's a student potentially, and that reaching out to people for collaboration, partnering with people who are different in classes, I think it's such an important step. Creating community around people who don't normally have a built-in community is a huge, huge thing. And I think, again, I would implore you, I mean, that could go to just such a long way. I veered off topic a little bit, so I'll rely on Chris and Sarah to bring it back in.
No, I think you were right on trend, so no worries.
I really like Aisha's point about like talk to people those of us who are here, like work with us. I think that's the easiest thing that anyone can individually pick up and start doing. If you think about, you know, you're sitting in some sort of decision-making space about how your organization is going to do the things. Again, I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, in that like the burden of enough data has to be different for this sort of thing. That you can't say, oh, well, there isn't 100 people, so we're not going to look at that group. We're going to just like throw that data away. You can't make decisions like that. So you have to actually consider like a little bit more creativity, a little bit more like asking questions, a little bit more anecdotal, because that's what, like, you have to think about qualitative things, which is what data scientists were not always prepared to do. And so like, you know, one of the stories that came out in this was undergraduates looking at them, keeping them in, you know, an engineering major, but it was for Latina women. They often change their major because of familial pressure to have children young. That's not something that affects white women or African-American women in the United States. Like those pressures don't come from our families. But for Latino women in the United States, that was a huge pressure that was causing them to change their major to something less demanding so that they could meet their family's expectations. Where for African-American women, it was often like the hostility in the classroom, or they were changing their major to something less demanding so they could work more hours because they simply needed more money to pay for tuition. And so, I mean, these are undergraduate, like problems at the graduate level are going to be different. Graduate students are typically funded, so it's a little bit there. But if, you know, you have to pick up what the actual particulars are of where people, like why people can't stay. And, you know, I'm not in the best position to say what those things are because I made it through. Like I have a tenure track position. I figured out how to stay here. I mean, I know some people who left, but you can't, like, they can't just ask those of us who made it through. You have to actually like find the people who left your program and find out why. And no one likes that. It feels bad. So people avoid it. And I think, but unfortunately, that's where the answers are going to be like, how could we have stopped this thing that already happened?
Sarah, I think your point about disaggregating experiences is so important in understanding why different cohorts may stay or leave. And so I just wanted to sit with that for a second because I think that's a big part of it. I think another thing that any institution could also consider is this challenge that I've heard many times related to equity versus equality and what we do. And so, you know, if I say, you know, I'm seeing this student cohort that has these challenges related to staying in a major, or they're feeling pushed out because of this behavior or this policy, can we change it? Many times in several different institutions, I've gotten some variation of that. You know, that's an equitable approach, but because this student cohort would receive more benefit from it, it's not an equal approach, and so we can't do it. We can't provide support to these young faculty or support in this way to all young faculty, because these faculty who are historically marginalized in some way will receive more benefit from this. And so that's going to be a problem for the old senior faculty. They're not going to like it. So that's a non-starter. We can't do it. Ooh, I'm real sorry. So there are a lot of power players in all of our institutions that may not use this lens of different cohorts and equitable versus equal actions. And so how do we, I know some of these folks have a very long understanding of the institution and are very powerful and very valued for their contributions, but if they're wrong, if they're standing in the way of this progress, how do we gently just move them out of the way so that we can get some of these policies in place? Is one piece of food for thought I'd offer.
Yeah, I want to transition into sort of thinking about, for all of you, you're reflecting on your experiences. And, you know, oftentimes in DEI work, there's an expectation that the folks with the lived oppressive experiences are the galvanizers of the work and are front and center on the committee that's going to eventually die on a hill or what have you. So how in your careers have you reconciled that you have a deep commitment to supporting students, to identifying or highlighting where there are systemic issues in the space of being a woman of color in academic experiences, but also that you're researchers and you're academics and you have commitments of engaging in your own intellectual discovery of the research that you want to do and being on the careers that you've set out to be. And sort of how do you reconcile sort of sometimes what might feel like a push and pull in sort of the commitment to that work? And then what would you say to others that don't identify in your identities about becoming better stewards of the work, or sort of getting on the DEI train?
I can start here, and I can say that this is not something that I have excelled at. I finished my PhD and went into a postdoc, and I was so burnt out from trying to do both my research and doing so much other diversity things that I had an 18-month postdoc that I barely got anything out of research-wise, because I recovered basically and brought myself back to being a human, but my research suffered. And so I think it's really hard. What has worked somewhat, my current strategy that's proving to be a little bit more effective, I think, is really recognizing that I can't do it all. And there are some people who are more privileged who want to be allies. They don't really know where to start, but they're willing to put in all the extra effort. And so, I can go to them and say the 3-minute unfiltered version of what I think needs to be done. And then they can go play all the politics to get it through whatever organizational, whatever has to happen. Right. And I think that finding those allies who can go and put in the way more time than I actually have to do it, and they'll be approaching it from a position of greater power than what I have, right? There were times as a graduate student, I saw something happen that couldn't deal with, but I knew one professor, a senior white man, who could go and he could fix it because he was a full professor. So there was nothing he had no consequences, and he had been there a long time and he knew how to talk to all the people, and he could go through and fix those things. He didn't identify the problems on his own. He didn't necessarily see them on his own. But if I told him that it was there, he trusted me and he would go and figure out what the fix was. And so I think kind of that's been one of the strategies I've leaned on a lot lately. And, as a professor now, listening to students, sometimes I can't fix the thing, but I can give them the first few steps, and then I can find someone else in my institution who can help them. And really noting that there are other people whose job really is just to do that work, and I have to go find them and direct students over there. because the students don't necessarily know those people are there either, right? Universities are really large and confusing. So that's kind of been my approach lately, is like delegating and pushing it off, because otherwise there just aren't enough hours in the day to do that and research.
I've taken the strategy. So one, I think advocating for research related to diversity, equity, and inclusion as legitimate research is important. It feels like in a lot of spaces, it's like, okay, that's fine if you do that, but it's kind of a side gig sort of thing. That's great. We're grateful for it. But if you're doing legitimate research, it should be recognized as such by promotion committees, by tenure committees, and it isn't always. So I think particularly universities when thinking about tenure and promotion need to examine that more closely. Another thing is that I have decided that I am going to bring diversity, inclusion, and equity questions with me wherever I go. It's not just going to be in a DEI subcommittee meeting. It's going to be in the faculty meeting and someone says something about, well, diverse students, but we're really looking for excellence. So how do we get that? What do you mean by that? Let's unpack that a little bit. Because then people who don't normally think about these questions they heard me. And maybe they take that with them to their next meeting. The third thing that I wanted to mention is just I feel I can do this a little bit now that I'm an associate professor, is I try to bring people along with me to diversity efforts. So I'll say, I think you would be really great for this person that I have not seen participate in this space before. Would you be willing to help out with this event? I'd love for you to come and talk with the students in this way to get more people who don't normally participate in this work to participate in this work. It can't be a segmented part of what we do.
I think this perspective, it changed a lot from grad student life to actually being a professor. So in graduate school, it was really important for me to be very aware of how much I could handle, like my capacity constraints. And my top priority was making it through. So, I would do stuff on the side, but like constrained to like, let me get out of this program so I can have more visibility, frankly, to do more. It's kind of, and I'm not saying that was necessarily the right perspective. That is just the perspective that I had, especially because there was only so much I could handle in grad school. But I feel like there's a multi-pronged problem that I haven't actually quite worked out as a professor, and it was touched on. One is being asked to do way too many things. I was warned of this. Everyone has told me about this. But it's just really even funny that like the people who are set to mentor me are like, you won't get any credit for doing all these things, but also, can you do this? And can you do that? And they'll be asking me and they'll be like, say no to everyone else, but say yes to me because I'm the person who's mentoring. I can't even tell you, and also there's this separation from the service I want to do, the stuff I really care about, the DEI work I care about, and also the service that's expected from me that's more just institutionally based. And I don't get as much credit for the DEI stuff as I do for, admissions committees and all these other things, which are important and but it just ends up being a lot. And so, I've just started, I'm only a year and some change in, and so I'm still figuring out, like truly in the midst of figuring out how to set boundaries truly and appropriately, because it is a lot and you won't understand how to navigate it until you're in it. So that is one. And the second point that I think Chris touched upon is research. And I've gotten a lot of advice from a lot of people. I'll keep my ear open and weigh it accordingly. But a lot of the advice is, if you focus on research problems that have an emphasis in equity, it will not be weighted as much than if you concentrate on efficiency or you do this like core biological policy. Like there's definitely in some people's minds within the institution a hierarchy of importance of problems, and problems that are more geared towards underserved communities, not so much tenure worthy, as kind of the message, at least, that being sent to me by some people, not all people, but some. And so, yeah, that's a lot to emotionally navigate. So, as someone who feels like, you're given this platform to do the things you want to do, but at the same time feel like the things you want to do are not as worthy as some of these other long-standing things that people find interesting. So, I don't know that I have any resolution to these. I've identified them as problems in my own life space that I've been thinking through actually quite a bit. I'll leave it.
No, I appreciate that, because I think I struggle sometimes with the commodification of diversity work, and when is it most beneficial, and when do people use it as sort of a value add to sort of leverage more versus, and I don't know that I can always sort of lay claim to how earnest someone is in their motivations with the work, but sometimes, trying to measure out what are the motivations for why the work is being done or the value of the work. So I definitely understand that. So I'm going to transition into some questions that have come in through the Q&A. And the one I'll ask right now is sort of connected to the conversation that we're having. So it says, regarding the point of not piling all the DEI work on the shoulders of the same 3 people in a department/company, how might we systematically encourage and incentivize broader participation, specifically even among those who are well-intentioned in this space, but have a hesitancy to take on DEI roles due to lack of personal lived experience?
I can jump in based on the kind of building on what I said before about, I've started relying on people who I know could be good allies. I think if you can position yourself, that build the trust with the people who are being overburdened, that you're sincere and that you want to do it, that is one way of overcoming the hesitancy. You might not have the personal lived experience, but you can listen, and oftentimes there's like the idea, and then it's just going to take a lot of like churning and like just doing a lot of things. You can take on the just doing a lot of the things, right? Like that's a way that, you can offset that this person who had the idea, but they're so burnt out because they're emotionally dealing with the actual like microaggressions on a daily basis that they've experienced, right? So you can then take and you can send the 20 emails that it takes to get like one minor thing changed, right? So I think that's sort of the position that I've seen start to work. And another thing I want to point out is that if you approach it with compassion and like care, perfection is not necessary, because doing nothing is still going to be worse than waiting until you have the perfect idea. So as long as you're not steamrolling with your idea that's not based in lived experiences, and you're listening and responsive, like as things can come and go and up and change, I think that it will be appreciated even if it's not perfect.
Can I also say one thing? I feel like there's a class of DEI work that, frankly, only women of color are really uniquely suited for. And I see this mostly I have students reaching out to me from other universities, graduate students of color, that are like, I need to just understand how you made it through. I'm encountering this. Did you have to deal with this? How did you deal with that? And that's the kind of work that goes completely unrecognized, but to me is just one of the most important pieces of work service that I will do. And that I think I must do. And that's one level of work. And to Sarah's point, there's another layer of work, which is, you could sit down and grab coffee with me. I have tons of ideas, but being on the actual panel, going through the hour-long weekly meetings is not something that I have the capacity for, but I do want my ideas to shape, some of what's being done. And so I think just grabbing coffee and being like, I want to do this. What do you think? And getting at least my input, that would be, really, really nice way to take the load off me, but also be aware of the opinions of other people in the department who are more firsthand working on some of this stuff. So that's what I'll say.
I will add that you don't have to experience systemic racism to be informed on systemic racism. So I also think that to be informed and to have understanding of the the concepts and the sort of inner workings of whether it's strategic approach to DEI or what have you is just as important as doing the listening and sort of advocating on behalf. And we need more people that sort of think about this work strategically in ways that sort of organize us to a goal. And so, that is the work of an ally, I would say. And so as much as you can shore yourself up with a good understanding, but also the perspective and respect of speaking on behalf of folks, not over folks of color, I think is very important. So we have 3 minutes left and time for one more question. And maybe in that our panelists can kind of wrap up any final thoughts. So the question is, what pathways exist for women who have been established in industry on the edge of data science, who now want to transition into data science wholly?
I feel most days like I'm still on the edge of data science, so I'll table this one, sorry.
I've also been very firmly in data science, I would say, from the beginning. And I don't know as much the industry experience as well at that layer, but I at least know from the research perspective that collaboration, and I feel like community is just so underrated in engineering and math, like just how decisions are made are based on what people think of you. Based on some underlying reality, but like just their impressions. It's just so funny how socially determined even things that are not supposed to be are. And just, I think having community and growing community and trying to connect with people is one of the most important things that no one ever told me in the beginning this job and my life would be about. And so again, if you wanted to do more data science-based things, starting with projects, linking into different groups or whatever avenues exist in your current space is probably one of the ways to grow. And it's difficult to do. So I don't have any direct strategy for that. But as to say, collaboration is how I've managed to navigate kind of shifting directions in research in my life. And I think that that's what I was advised to do and has borne out in practice.
And I also want to add that to challenge the idea that maybe what you're perceiving as the edge of data science is actually really in data science. Data science is a very amorphous, inherently and necessarily interdisciplinary thing. Like being the one proving the things does not make you any more central to data science than the person who's applying it and seeing how well it actually works in practice and in some sort of application domain. So I think that challenge where the boundaries are. I think data science, it needs to be expanded and broadened, and we really need to appreciate that it is a very broad thing. And so there aren't necessarily really like edges that you can be, oh, I'm on the edge and I want to be in the center. No, you're in, it's in. And I think that's an important thing to take away from this too.
So we are right at time. I wish I had double the time with the three of you to continue to talk, but I'm very appreciative of the time we have spent and the reflections that you all have shared relative to your experiences. And also thank you for what you do and the ways in which you support women of color and make more space. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this panel. And I think I'll pass it back to either Kathy or Erin, but either way, thank you all. And please enjoy the rest of the conference.
And I'd like to thank you also, all of the panelists, for what you do to encourage women of color and others also, all of us. I'm actually inspired by you all and feel that we have a lot of work to do. So thank you very much. Thank you, Alana, for organizing this panel and moderating it. And thank you to all of you for your participation.